Standing on top of the Great Pyramid here, and that means I'm standing on latitude 30. The Great Pyramid stands precisely 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. Egyptologists know this, but again, they regard it as an accident. So many accidents are called for by their theory of history that I think it's time we seriously questioned that theory and stopped blindly accepting it. This monument weighs 6 million tons. 6 million tons. And its sides are perfectly oriented to the cardinal directions. The north face of the Great Pyramid faces directly towards the North Pole of the Earth. The deviation is just 3/60ths of a single degree. By the way, the deviation of the Meridian building of the Greenwich Observatory in London is 9/60ths of a degree. This monument is more precisely aligned to true north than the Greenwich Observatory in London. This monument is the work of master astronomers and master engineers, master surveyors, a work of brilliance and genius, a work that we should all stand before in awe, not with any certainties, but with open minds and open hearts. Above all else, Giza is a sacred place. It's a place of mystery and magic, a place that works on the imagination, a place that generates questions to those who do approach it with humility and with an open mind. We're looking at a cross-section of the Great Pyramid here along its meridian axis, north to south. And as you can see, it's plentifully equipped with shafts and chambers and galleries and narrow corridors. All of these features are engineering marvels. To create this kind of internal structure in a monument on that scale is an unbelievably difficult task. Let's take a quick tour around the Great Pyramid. We'll start by going down the descending corridor, and then I'll take you to the Queen's Chamber and the Grand Gallery, and finally the King's Chamber. But before I do so, I just want to mention a little bit about these 4 shafts here. The southern shaft of the so-called Queen's Chamber was found in 1993 to have a little door at the end of it. The shaft is 8 inches wide and 8 inches high, and it was explored with a high-tech robot camera in 1993. And as soon as that door was discovered, the research into the shaft was stopped in a most sinister and extraordinary manner. And at the end of our presentations, Robert and I will be presenting to you the latest information for what is happening concerning that door, and also concerning a chamber beneath the Great Sphinx of Egypt. And very disturbing things indeed are happening at Giza today, and we want to tell you about this, but we'll come to that later. Let's take a quick run around the Great Pyramid now. We'll start by going down the descending corridor. The descending corridor is perfectly straight. In fact, it doesn't vary by more than 1/4 of an inch from perfectly straight along its entire 350-foot length. It's 3 feet 5 inches high and 3 feet 5 inches wide. And at the bottom of it, we find the subterranean chamber, so-called. Now, Egyptologists have a theory about this chamber, and everything is theory where the Great Pyramid is concerned, because the monument is uninscribed. There's nothing really in it which tells us what the chambers are for. It's all theory. The Egyptological theory about this subterranean chamber is based on its unfinished appearance, these fins of rock that we find at the western end, and the generally rough look of it. What they want us to believe is that after quarrying out more than 2,000 tons of rock from that perfectly straight descending corridor and painstakingly removing them from the bedrock under the Great Pyramid, and having finally got down here more than 100 feet below the base of the Great Pyramid, and having started to carve out this chamber from the bedrock, those whimsical ancient Egyptians at the last minute just changed their minds and decided to go no further, because the Egyptological theory is that this was originally intended to be the burial chamber of Khufu, the pharaoh who they think the pyramid was built for. So those ancient Egyptian builders, after doing all that incredibly precise work, well, they just changed their minds and they decided to stick the body of the pharaoh somewhere else in the Great Pyramid. Actually, the body of the pharaoh has never been found in the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid was found to be completely empty when it was first opened by the Arabs in the 9th century. And we think that this unfinished burial chamber routine is a load a load of bollocks. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. These people knew exactly what they were doing. Everything they did had a purpose. You stand down in the subterranean chamber, you can hear somebody sing in the king's chamber, 250 feet above you, through all that mass of solid rock. The acoustic effects of this monument are extraordinary. And one thing that our friend John Anthony West has suggested, and I think it's a damn sight better theory than the theory of the Egyptologists, is that what they were actually doing with this chamber was tuning the pyramid, that they were tuning its acoustic effects. And when they had extracted precisely the right amount of rock from under the pyramid to hit precisely the right note that they wanted, that's when they stopped. That's why it looks unfinished. It's not unfinished at all. It was fulfilling a plan, a function. And everything about this site is planned, as Robert will be explaining in more detail when he comes to discuss our book, Keeper of Genesis. This is the so-called Queen's Chamber. We have to use these phrases, so-called, because all these attributions are arbitrary in this anonymous monument. And there, in the southern wall of the Queen's Chamber, that dark patch is the opening to the southern shaft. And it was into that dark place that that little robot camera was inserted in 1993, and after a journey of 200 feet, reached that mysterious door that we'll be talking about later. From the Queen's Chamber, we find ourselves in the Grand Gallery. It's 153 feet long and 28 feet high. It's a corbel vault. Each layer of stone is laid a little bit closer to the center line than the layer underneath it. And it bears around it millions of tons of pyramid. Remember, this is a monument that's at least 4,500 years old. I'm sure quite a few people in this room have been inside it and have walked up that Grand Gallery. It can be a little claustrophobic, but one thing you're sure of, when you're in there, you're safe. It's not like modern jerry building, where buildings fall down after 30 years. This is a work of architectural grandeur on an amazing scale, of architectural brilliance. To create a monument on this size and scale with a wonderful gallery in the heart of it like this, in the middle of an earthquake zone. There was a very bad earthquake there in 1992. It didn't touch the Great Pyramid at all. It caused massive disasters in Cairo, but the pyramids were unhurt by it. So again, we're looking at the work of geniuses when we look at architecture like this. Come to the top of the Grand Gallery, and you find yourself in the so-called King's Chamber, where Egyptologists assume, on no evidence, that the body of Khufu, that 4th dynasty pharaoh, was buried. We have to allow this chamber to speak for itself, and the way that it speaks is through the language of mathematics. It's a perfect 2x1 rectangle, for example. It's 34 feet 4 inches in length and 17 feet 2 inches in width. The half diagonal of the floor is equivalent exactly to the height of the chamber. So it's a sort of mathematical symphony in solid stone. And the stone used, by the way, is granite, which is interesting because there is no granite in the area of the Giza pyramids. The pyramid, main body of the pyramid, is made of local limestone, but the granite came from far away. The nearest granite is 500 miles to the south, and this pink granite came from Aswan in Upper Egypt. There are precisely 100 blocks making up the wall of the king's chamber, and some of those blocks weigh as much as 70 tons each, brought 500 miles from the south and then raised to 150 feet above the ground, supposedly by technological primitives. Does it make sense? I don't think it makes sense. Again, we're looking at a work of genius here. Now then, there I am in the supposed sarcophagus of Khufu. I mean no irreverence to Khufu, but I don't think he was ever buried in this supposed sarcophagus. I don't think it's a sarcophagus at all. Robert and I have studied the meaning and the purpose of the pyramids in great depth in our new book, Keeper of Genesis, and we think, and there's a great deal of evidence for it, that whatever else they were, these monuments were used by many pharaohs in an amazing initiation ceremony that cultivated the power of knowledge in their minds and the spiritual dimension of their lives. And everything suggests that this plain granite box at the western end of that anonymous chamber high up in the body of the Great Pyramid was the culminating point of this initiation ceremony, when the pharaoh sought in his mind to go beyond death, to reach out for the life of millions of years that is spoken of in the ancient Egyptian texts. What I actually want to draw attention to here is the way that this box was made. Granite is a very hard stone, as many of us are aware. And anybody who's ever worked stone will know that you cannot cut granite with copper tools. And the ancient Egyptians of the Pyramid Age are supposed to have just become familiar with copper. More interestingly than that, it's become clear that this box and many other granite artifacts like it were not made by using abrasive drills, by using abrasion, sand, to gradually wear away the granite. They were made with tubular drills, a drill in the form of a tube which cut down into the granite, and then the drill core was knocked out with a hammer, and then another tubular drill was brought down beside it, another drill core was created, that was knocked out, and so on and so forth. The first real study of this was done by a great Egyptologist, Flinders Petrie, at the turn of the century, and he found many granite drill cores lying around Giza and at other sites in Egypt, and he did a close examination of these drill cores. You can learn a lot from a drill core because the tooth marks of the drill are still embedded in it. And what he learnt really disturbed him, because this was a man with a very orthodox conclusion about the origins and nature of Egyptian civilization. And yet he couldn't explain this. When he analyzed the cut marks in those drill cores, he found that these tubular drills had been descending into the granite with a pressure of more than 2 tons being applied to them from above. Now, how do you do that with copper into granite? How do you apply a 2-ton pressure without the whole mechanism buckling and failing to do the job? It just can't be explained in the orthodox view of history. A colleague of ours, Chris Dunn, who's a machine tool maker from Danville Metal Stamp in the United States, has been re-examining these drill cores quite recently. And he's come to an astounding conclusion, which I'll simply report to you without going further than that. His analysis of the cut marks suggests that whatever drills these people were using were cutting into the granite 500 times faster than modern power drills. I prefer the opinion of a machine tool maker to the opinion of an Egyptologist when it comes to drilling matters, and I think Chris Dunn's views on this deserve further consideration. This is the so-called burial chamber of Menkaura, the third of the supposed 3 pharaohs who built the 3 Great Pyramids at Giza. The Pyramid of Menkaura is the smallest of the 3 Great Pyramids, although it's still well over 200 feet tall. If we are to follow Egyptological logic, then we must conclude that this chamber was built by a certain B. Wilson. That this is not the Pyramid of Menkaura, it's the Pyramid of B. Wilson. And the reason that we have to conclude that is because they apply that logic to the single piece of writing that was found inside the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Above the king's chamber, there are 4 so-called relieving chambers, and in those some graffiti was found, very crudely daubed graffiti. And some of that graffiti bears the name Khufu, and also another name, Khnum Khufu. And like drowning men leaping at straws, Egyptologists have concluded that because that graffiti is there, it means that the Great Pyramid was built by Khufu. I don't think that a little piece of graffiti in a chamber hidden away inside the Great Pyramid is a very solid piece of evidence to attribute such an important monument to a particular pharaoh. As a matter of fact, those graffiti may well have been a forgery, but even if they, by the original discoverer, Howard Vyse, but even if they aren't forgeries, it's just not enough for us to attribute the monument to Khufu on the basis of such slim evidence. Where B. Wilson wrote his name, we see a curved roof. It's a sort of barrel vault, and these are granite blocks that form the ceiling, and they were hollowed out from underneath. It doesn't look very prepossessing, but when you get above it, you begin to realize the construction problems that were involved in making this roof. There I am on the top end of those ceiling beams. This is how they look above. And I want to make clear there's no way that these blocks were lowered down from above, because this is an entirely subterranean chamber. And the only way it can be reached is through a long corridor system that finally culminates in the chamber. So all of these blocks were brought in through that long corridor system. They weigh 20 tons each. And as you can see, there's hardly room for me to crouch in the area where they've been placed. There just isn't enough room to position blocks of that size and weight in the way that we see them there. So again, like it or not, we're looking at the evidence of a building technology that we don't understand. And quite often, when we go to Giza, we pass by things like this without realizing what they really mean. If I can get it into focus, we're looking down on the Great Sphinx of Egypt from the side of the Great Pyramid. The Great Sphinx, as Robert will explain, faces perfectly due east. It's oriented precisely to due east. And it was made by cutting it out of solid bedrock. It's 240 feet long and 70 feet high, and it was carved out of solid bedrock. The core body was isolated by removing this trench of rock around it, and those rocks that were cut away from the core body were then sawn up into blocks, and those blocks were erected in front of the Sphinx in these two so-called temples, the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple. They're also entirely anonymous monuments, like the Sphinx, and actually, to be honest, we don't really know what their function is. But the interesting thing is the size of the blocks used in making those structures. We're looking at a side view of the Valley Temple here, and you can see the problem. These blocks of stone weigh 200 tons each, and there's hundreds of them. And they were put into position at the same time that the Sphinx was made. I'll be briefly outlining later on the geological evidence, which indicates that the Sphinx may be at least 12,000 years old. Since we know that this temple was made at the same time as the Sphinx, if it is 12,000 years old, and the astronomical evidence that Robert will be covering also corroborates that, then it means that 12,000 years ago, there were people on this planet who had the ability to lift and manipulate 200-ton blocks of stone. And this is a serious problem for the Orthodox view of history, because 12,000 years ago, we were supposed to have been in an extremely primitive stage, living in caves. There's one other place in Egypt where you find these bare stone anonymous monuments using vast blocks, very similar to those of the Valley Temples. And this is the Osirion in Upper Egypt, near Abydos. It lies at a level 50 feet below surrounding temples. But because there is a temple of Seti I nearby, albeit 50 feet above it, archaeologists have deduced with their characteristic brilliance that this amazing structure must have been made by Seti I. There's no evidence for that. On the contrary, all the evidence suggests that it belongs to the same category of architecture as those mysterious temples at Giza, and that it may be as old as they are, that we may be looking at a 12,000-year-old monument here. And that's why it's interesting that it was always called the Osirion. It was associated with Osiris, with the high god Osiris, who the ancient Egyptians remembered as having come to their country in a remote period that they called Zeptepi, the first time, thousands of years before history began, bringing the gifts of civilization with him. There are many images of Osiris in Egypt. Here's one that's actually carved in that Seti I temple that I just talked about. And as you can see, he's a conspicuously bearded figure. In fact, Osiris and the symbolism of Osiris has much in common, and I've gone into this in some depth in Fingerprints of the Gods, with the symbolism of Viracocha and of Quetzalcoatl. My bet is, in all these figures, we're looking at memories of the survivors of a great lost civilization who settled in various parts of the world and whose mission was to keep the light of their knowledge burning and to find a way over millennia of barbarism to pass that knowledge down to the future, perhaps even to our own time, perhaps even to us today. As I said, Osiris was remembered by the ancient Egyptians as having come in the first time, long before history began. You talk to Egyptologists about Egyptian history, and they will tell you that they know far more about the history of Egypt than the ancient Egyptians did themselves. This arrogant statement has been made in print by several Egyptologists, and yet the Egyptological chronology of ancient Egypt is based entirely on ancient Egyptian records such as these. This is the king list of Pharaoh Seti I at Abydos, and he's showing his young son Ramesses II a list of all the kings of Egypt who'd ruled before their time, together with the lengths of their reigns. And the notion that we have of 30 dynasties of Egyptian pharaohs is based on this king list and on other king lists like these. On the opposite wall of the same temple is another list, which again is matched by many other lists that the ancient Egyptians passed down. And this is a list of a mysterious group of beings called the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who were believed by the ancient Egyptians to have ruled in Egypt for thousands of years before the first pharaoh of the first dynasty took the throne. The followers of Horus, who retained a memory of the divine origins of their civilization, whose mission was to pass that memory down to the future, and who were attributed by the ancient Egyptians themselves as the guardians of the wisdom legacy that ancient Egypt inherited. These references to the first time, to the followers of Horus, to this remote prehistoric period when the gods came to Egypt, are found again and again in the oldest scriptures of mankind, carved on the walls here of a 5th dynasty pyramid, the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara. These are called the pyramid texts, and they were compiled roughly in the epoch of 2500 to 2300 BC. They contain repeated references to this mysterious period, the first time. And I'll leave it to Robert in his talk on our book, Keeper of Genesis, to really bring out what the first time means. It's difficult to see in this light, but on the ceiling of this chamber there are hundreds of stars, and the pyramid texts are full of references to the stars and to the heavens, very precise and very specific references. What we think is that astronomy can be used to arrive at a precise date for the first time, as Robert will be showing you. Astronomy relating to these monuments on this profoundly astronomically aligned site. This photograph was taken at the winter solstice with the sun overhead the pyramid of Menkaura. And just a little bit on the Sphinx. When we say the word Sphinx, we're actually speaking the ancient Egyptian language, because Sphinx is a corruption through Greek of the ancient Egyptian phrase Sheshep Ankh. And Sheshep Ankh means living image, living image. But the question is, whose living image does the Sphinx represent? Egyptologists think they know the answer to this question. And their theory about who the Sphinx represents and about the age of the Sphinx, their opinion on this matter, is falsely presented as fact in all our textbooks and all our encyclopedias. You look up the Sphinx of Egypt in the Encyclopedia Britannica or any other text of that nature, and you'll be told, without any question mark over the matter, that it was built by the pharaoh Khafre in his own image in around 2500 BC. And yet, the Great Sphinx, like the pyramids, is an entirely anonymous monument. And since it's carved from raw stone, we have no objective way of dating it. What we're dealing with that attribution to Khafre is purely and simply Egyptological opinion. And as Robert and I have gone on with our work into Giza and into the monuments of Giza, we have come to trust Egyptological opinion on these matters less and less. In fact, we don't think that the Egyptological opinion on these matters is right at all. We think the Egyptologists have got it totally and utterly wrong. Perhaps you agree with us, perhaps you don't. But one thing is for sure. It's very bad scholarship that the opinion of scholars should be presented as fact when it isn't fact. Let's see what the Egyptological opinion about the identification of the Sphinx really rests on. One thing it rests on is the face of the Sphinx. Egyptologists tell us that this anonymous monument looks like Khafre. And they say that because there are a few statues of Khafre that have survived which actually have Khafre's name on them. And so they compare the face of the Sphinx with the face of a known statue of Khafre, like this one, which is in the Cairo Museum. And they tell us that the two faces are identical. Well, we don't see it that way. We don't think that the two faces look similar at all. We think they look very different, but don't take our word for it, and don't take the word of Egyptologists for it. The person who really is an authority on faces is somebody like a police forensic artist, somebody who's made a lifetime study of the similarities and differences between faces. And back in the early 1990s, colleagues of ours, led by John Anthony West, brought a police forensic artist to Giza, Lieutenant Frank Domingo of the New York Police Department, with 20 years on the force. And he did a very careful point-by-point identikit comparison of the face of the Sphinx and the face of Khafre. And here are some of his drawings. What he concluded is that he just couldn't understand why Egyptologists were under the impression that the Sphinx looked like Khafre. He saw no resemblance between the two faces at all, and when he compared key angles of the faces, he concluded, he swore an affidavit to this effect, that whoever the Great Sphinx's face represents, it certainly does not represent the face of Khafre. The angles of the face are completely different, and he in fact concluded that the Great Sphinx represented an individual of an entirely different race from Khafre. Okay, so that dismisses the facial similarity view that Egyptologists wish to foist on us. What else do they base their attribution of the Sphinx to Khafre on? They tell us that there are certain texts around Giza which say that the Sphinx was built by Khafre. Let's look briefly into this issue. Let's start with a text that was found at Giza which says very definitely that the Sphinx was not built by Khafre. This is the so-called inventory stela, which stands neglected in a corner of the Cairo Museum today. According to Egyptologists, the inventory stela is a work of fiction. It's an ancient Egyptian novel, which we have to ignore